Okay, so I'm going to start the presentation. Today we're going to talk about empowering youth for climate action in the FCT, which is basically Abuja, Nigeria. And I am Tolu. So we're going to start by looking at the presentation outline and then we would dive into the presentation. So for the presentation outline, we're going to start by looking at the SDGs very briefly. Then we would look at climate change. After that, we would examine climate action and we would look at areas in climate change, some specific areas, not all the areas, because it's a very broad topic and we can't cover everything. Next, we would look at implementing climate action. In part 6, we'll look at some relevant organizations that deal with climate change for young people to be involved in climate change, and then the conclusion of the presentation. So let's start with the SDGs. The MDGs, which were basically the Millennium Development Goals, ran for about 15 years. So we're looking at from about 2000 to 2015. However, in 2015, the SDGs were announced, which are basically the Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations. And the goal of the SDGs is to make the world a better place for people, planet, profits, prosperity within a 15-year period. So the SDGs are scheduled to run from about 2015 to 2030, and there are timelines. So for instance, under goal 1 you have target 1.1, something like that, with specific timelines. Some of those timelines have passed and very few of the timelines relating or targets relating to the SDGs have been met. So we have 17 SDGs and in total we have 169 targets and indicators. That's basically factoring in the sub indicators and sub targets under each of the respective SDGs. SDG 13 is climate action, and for the focus of this presentation, we would spend more time looking at SDG 13. So we're going to start by looking at climate change. So climate change has to do with change in climatic patterns as a result of anthropogenic activities. So when we say anthropogenic activities, we're referring to man-made activities, man-made causes. Yes, the climate is constantly changing, the planet is constantly changing, but human activities expedite the change process. And I usually like to start by defining weather, right? So weather has to do with the average condition of the atmosphere at a particular place at a particular time. Then when you say climate, you're referring to the average weather condition at a particular place over a period of usually 30 to 35 years. So when you're saying climate change, you're saying the average weather condition of a place over several intervals of 30 to 35 years severally has changed significantly. So that's basically what climate change is about. Next, we're going to look at climate action. And then climate action is more like the antidote for climate change. It has to do with the steps that we take as individuals to either adapt or to mitigate the effect of climate change. In climate change, there are two keywords. You're either talking about adaptation or you're talking about mitigation. So when you're talking about adaptation, you're basically saying that in relation to the changes that have already occurred, how can human beings position themselves to live with the changes in the climate without further expediting the climate change process? Now, when you say mitigation, you're talking about preventing the climate change from further increasing or from basically from scaling. That's basically what you mean by mitigation. So majority of the solutions, majority of the methods, majority of the techniques and certain areas of climate change, they either fall under adaptation or they fall under mitigation. So some key areas in climate change, we can't cover all of them, but I have picked some really important areas and I would speak on them briefly. So first, we have climate finance. Climate finance has to do with money. If there's no money, you cannot solve any problem. And I like to say that whoever funds an idea owns an agenda, right? So for climate change, there has to be a lot of money involved. And climate finance is often related with a concept that we call loss and damage. So when we say loss and damage, we're talking about the losses and damages either in terms of human beings, animals, or even properties. So we're talking about life properties that have been lost or damaged as a result of climate change. And then climate finance is more like the antidote for loss and damage in a way. Next, we have to do with health. So there has been very few conversations around the synergy between climate change and health. It's usually referred to as eco-anxiety, which basically has to do with mental health issues that happen as a result of climate change. And for the first time at COP28 last year in Dubai, health was included on the COP agenda, because when you talk to a young person about climate change, I mean, we've moved from the era where people say climate change is not real, right? So when you talk to people about climate change now, you begin to hear young people say, oh, should I marry? Should I have children? Where should I be alive? Is the world ending today? Is the world ending tomorrow? There's a lot of eco-anxiety and mental health issues that basically arise as a result of climate change. There are other physical and basic health issues. Could be maybe increase in epidemics, as we have seen, or pandemics, increase in diseases. Either we're talking about waterborne, airborne, or whatever kind of infection generally as a result of changing climatic patterns. So that's basically the area that has to do with health. Next, we have energy transition, and over the course of the last, you can see 5 years, conversation have shifted. So under a synergy between climate action and energy, you can have a topic, maybe renewable energy as one topic. You can have energy transition as another topic. You can have green jobs as another topic. You can have just transition as another topic. But it basically says, or basically has to do with sustainable and renewable forms of energy, and ensuring that there is a drastic reduction in energy poverty globally, especially in Africa. So that is a key point to note when we speak about climate action in relation to energy transition. There are also conversations around green jobs that are and just transition that are linked to climate action. So because we're talking about green energy, we're talking about renewable energy, we're talking about sustainable energy, then there has to be awareness on green jobs, especially for young people. So we talk about things like changing the educational curriculum for young people to learn about, these things in school. So that is also another area. Next, here we have marine life, and it's not just restricted to marine life, but a lot happens with the change in the ecosystem, and marine life conversations around climate change and marine life are often linked to plastic pollution and pollution of water bodies. We also talk about the death of sea creatures. I know there was this popular video some years back of a turtle that had a straw stuck in its nose. So these are some of the things that we talk about, right? Microplastics entering into the human food chain, basically from marine life, because of the way we choose to dispose plastics in water bodies. Another key area is climate education, and each of these subtopics are very big. Climate education has almost 6 to 8 cardinal points in itself alone. So we're talking about awareness, we're talking about advocacy, we're talking about educational curriculum, we're talking about storytelling. Just basically saying, how do we ensure that people know what climate change is? How do we ensure people know how their actions contribute significantly to climate change? How do we ensure that people know what steps they can take to either adapt and mitigate the effects of climate change? So that's one area. Another area is also ecofeminism, and ecofeminism is becoming a very big topic. It's popularly known as the nexus between gender and climate action, and it specifically refers to the effect of climate change on women. So the effect of climate change on different class of people and biodiversity is disproportional, basically. So the way it affects men is different from the way it affects women, because of basically culture, tradition, and gender related roles. So women basically are largely and most significantly affected by climate change, and a key example would be this. So in a case where you have a flooding and women and girls are displaced when they are moving as migrants, which is also another subtopic I will come to next, why they are moving as a result of that displacement, they are prone more to infections and diseases because of their biology. Another area is also in relation to wash, basically has to do with water, sanitation, and hygiene. Women need more of wash resources compared to men, again because of biology. So when climate migration happens, a lot of women or females do not necessarily have access to wash resources and wash amenities. So you can see how this in itself causes a ripple effect on the health of women compared to men. And even in these situations, women still have to ensure that the head of the house, the breadwinners, the men eat, and then the women are just left with whatever crumb is left from the table. So they don't even eat healthy generally. So these are some of the issues that we have to deal with when we talk about climate action. How do we empower women to better position them to be able to adapt to climate change and mitigate climate change? Next has to do with climate migration, which is big. There has been cause for movement, global mobility, and increase in global mobility. In Nigeria, we joke a lot and we call it Japa. But basically, part of the reasons why people Japa or migrate or move also has to do with climate change. Yes, there are conflicts, there are political insecurity and instability reasons, but there are also climate migration issues. So if your community or your home is destroyed by flood, you automatically become an internally displaced person. You automatically become a migrant, and you have to move to a next community, rely on the government or rely on a particular set of people to help you meet your basic needs and probably start over. Next, we have to do with nature-based solution, and this one is largely related to food and agriculture, saying what natural solutions can we implement. And sometimes indigenous knowledge can be separate, but sometimes indigenous knowledge can be linked to nature-based solution. For instance, in certain communities, they have totems. Totems are like deities or idols, and for a particular clan, their deity may be an elephant. And what that basically means is that people from that clan are not allowed to kill elephants, are not allowed to eat elephants, and it is their responsibility to conserve and preserve elephants. Same go for snakes and animals and also crops in particular. So that could also be a nexus between nature-based solution and indigenous knowledge. Another form of nature-based solution could basically be implementing certain farm practices to preserve the soil. For instance, in certain communities, after harvesting corn, you don't just remove the stalk, you wrap it and allow it to dry and rotten and decay in preparation for the next season, as a way to give cover to your soil. So these are some of the forms of nature-based solution. And a last example we will look at is climate policy and nationally determined contributions. So climate policy is very big and broad in itself, because we're trying to, see how we can have policies for each of these sub areas and even climate action in itself. However, a key component of climate policy has to do with nationally determined contributions. So the NDCs are a very popular term in climate action, and it basically has to say what are individual governments of nations doing to ensure that they can adapt and mitigate to the effect of climate change. In some countries, a key document for forming the sub NDCs is usually their climate act or their climate action plan. Some people use their climate action plan as their NDCs and vice versa. So it's basically saying what policies and how does the government work with various sectors, the private sector, the public sector, the press, and even non-governmental organizations, as well as developmental partners, to ensure that climate action is carried out. In Nigeria, we have a climate policy and a national determined contribution. And nationally determined contributions are reviewed periodically. So periodically, countries have to meet at the Conference of Party. I will speak briefly about that in the next slide, to say this is what we said we were going to do, and this is what we have done, and this is what we plan to do moving forward ahead of when next we need to renew our NDCs. Okay, so we're going to look at implementing climate action. When we talk about climate action, it can sound very broad, and you begin to wonder, as a young person, what exactly am I supposed to do? How do I contribute to this thing, right? I mean, it's part of the eco-anxiety we spoke about earlier. A key area or a key way to contribute is to volunteer. So you can volunteer on a project, you can volunteer with an organization locally or internationally, and just help with a particular project or help solve a problem relating to climate change that the organization is focusing on at that particular point in time. Another way you could contribute to climate action is through social entrepreneurship. So when we say social entrepreneurship, we're talking about solving climate action either through adaptation or mitigation efforts while creating a business model out of it. So that's basically what social entrepreneurship has to do with. So it could be, for one, climate education. You create an educational material, maybe a storybook, and you teach people about it, but then you get people to buy the storybook. So that is social entrepreneurship in relation to climate action. That's just one example, but there are also many ways, many business models, and many ideas for as many of the sub things that we looked at and other sub things that we didn't even look at. Another one is activism and advocacy. Yes, we have young people protesting. We have the popular Fridays for Future strike. We have people protesting at various international conferences, and that is one way. Another one is advocacy, by raising awareness and speaking for certain issues that you think require more attention from the government or other relevant stakeholders in relation to climate action. Another one is policy implementation. So it goes both with policy creation and implementation. It's one thing to have a policy, it's another thing to have a good and properly tailored, specifically tailored policy, and it's another thing to ensure that the implementation of the policy happens. A way policy implementation usually happens is through pledges. You hear people say pledge to this, sign this, hold the government accountable for this, we need 200 votes for this to fly. So that's a key way of implementation. Another area could be through media and storytelling, whether you're actually writing a fiction or you're writing non-fiction, or you're just using your personal brand or your social media to share about climate change, or even speaking in the actual media via the press. Others could be writing and publication. So it could be you being part of a consortium to say we need a reformation of a certain policy. It could be you contributing to research with a team of young people or a team of relevant industry experts. It could also be you writing a story, writing a book, or writing any relevant written material. That's a good way to contribute to climate action. And of course, you can use art to contribute. When we say art, we're talking about visual and non-visual. Whether you're writing, you're dancing, you're singing, you're acting a drama, it is also an interesting way to contribute to the implementation of climate action. There are many more, but because of time, we will just look at this few that we have on the slide. So we're going to talk about some relevant and important climate organizations. First one on the list is obviously the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, the United Nations is a big organization, and many times young people just want to work at the United Nations. What do you want to do at the UN? I don't know. Where do you want to work in the UN? I don't know. But the United Nations has sub-agencies, and the agency that is in charge of climate change under the United Nations is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We also have another international organization, the IPCC, but I forgot to add that. However, for young people that want to be actively involved in climate change, both on a national and international level, one of the first organizations you may consider is Yongo. Yongo is the official children and youth or youth and children constituency of the UNFCCC. And Yongo has different subgroups. So you have the Health Working Group, you have Just Transition Working Group, you have ACE, which has to do with Climate Education Working Group, you have the Press and Media Working Group, you have the Yongo Secretariat, you have different campaigns like the African Youth Mobilization for COP under Yongo. So you can Google Yongo and you would see an application form to apply as to why you want to be a Yongo member. Your application will be reviewed and you will be added to the mailing list. It's important for me to mention that the mailing list can become overwhelming. So you want to join, I usually advise one working group in Yongo because it's a lot of information. I'm not even going to lie to you. If you're someone that you don't delete your emails regularly, when you join Yongo, you would have to delete emails regularly. In a month, you can get an average of 100 emails. Yes, because you're on the mailing list, so you get emails from almost all the working groups. So you want to join a working group and be active in your working group, as well as show up for Yongo constituency meetings. Another very important and relevant youth group is the Children and Youth Major Group under the United Nations Environmental Program. So, yes, they do, especially in relations to plastic treaties, scientific innovations, nuclear disarmament. We also have a nuclear disarmament working group in Yongo. So it's also very active, very bubbly, and you want to be intentional about the group that you want to be a member of and be active there. We have other groups I did mention, like the land cactus, and there are so many other groups anyway, but we'll just stick to these ones. Under the Commonwealth Youth Network, you have the Commonwealth Climate Network, and then under the Commonwealth Climate Network, you have, of course, sub working groups. So you can keep an eye open, subscribe to the mailing list, wait for the applications to be out, fill in the forms, and become an active member of the Commonwealth Youth Climate Network. In Nigeria, we have our own National Council on Climate Change, which has been doing a very amazing and fantastic job, especially with relations to climate action and relevant policies like our NDCs in Nigeria. We also have the Nigeria Energy Transition Plan. You can Google them, you can find out the 5 key areas the transition plan covers, you can find out the key projects, different agencies, and how you can get involved. Of course, we have the Ministry of Environment that does amazing. My advice is always be actively involved with an international youth organization and be actively involved with at least a local youth organization. So when I say local youth organization, I'm referring to a local NGO. It can be a local NGO, a grassroots NGO in your local government area. It could be a local NGO that has a community base in Abuja and is active. For instance, we had a Sustivibe cleanup sometimes in April, right? So you want to be a part of something like that and be active, because you want to be relevant in the FCT, but you also want to be relevant on the global stage. You don't just want to be relevant on the global stage and not relevant in your local community. So that will be all for our presentation, and I will take questions if we have any.